Hello, that was a section from my recently completed piece for amplified cello and pre-recorded sounds, Sister Zen's sort of self-abnegation, which I wrote after living in the People's Republic of China for 2 years. This is news of the sweetest. Here from lyre and chest, one note twines round another, but this warbling's lost on me. It crawls into my ear, you see, yet my heart feels nothing here. The music has inspired me to come back to the nearby university town of Jena, home to Hegel and Frege, and many others who I've included in the story of the Weimar Identity Thesis. Specifically, I've come to admire the Llena Tower. Built in the late 1960s and early 70s, it's very tall. In fact, perhaps it's an optical illusion, but I've noticed that I can never actually see the top of the tower.
Weimar and Jena were both under the control at this time of a socialist government that in turn was under the control of Soviet Union hegemony. Culture and all building activity was a function of state, representing the socialist propaganda of those who wielded totalitarian authority. The purpose of all mega-towers and mega-opera and mega-symphony concerts was to reinforce the supremacy of the political agenda. The purpose of people's lives and aspirations and view upon tall towers like this was to celebrate the triumph of the human spirit over less politically desirable aspects of the human spirit. The Llena Tower is the work of Hermann Henselmann, who was originally appointed to the role of Director of the College of Architecture and Fine Arts in Weimar in 1945, in acknowledgement of his support for the Soviet Communist government. Thereafter he moved to East Berlin and developed a style fusing a modernism able to glorify the notions of both industrialism and social realism with an appropriate Stalinist neoclassical bent. And accordingly, he was asked to design what would be the tallest skyscraper in the German Democratic Republic, something that could give the historic city centre of this town a new modern socialist appearance. When the building was rejected by local industrialists, flexing their small degree of autonomy, the tower was offered to the Socialist University as a mighty symbol of a stringent control over potentially rebellious minds in awe of the decadent West. But if genuine intellectual activity in the East was suppressed, and revolution became a pseudonym for ideologies of repression and incarceration, only 100 kilometres to the west, a revolution of values was underway. It was there that theories on what had started as the Weimar Identity Thesis were being extended. I want to say something about what is often called the Kripkean Revolution of the early 1970s, which occurred at the same time as the tower here was under construction, and the significant implications brought to thinking of the time about what the mind is and how it conceives the world, and what the subject can know about the world and everything in it as a result.
I've come to the Jena Old Town. To introduce these ideas, I need to go back a little in time, to pre-Tower days, and consider again the tenets of logical positive thought from the first half of the 20th century, including the important roles given to empiricism and verification as tools of inquiry.
The logical positivists had embraced the Frege-Russell description theory of names, which can be traced back to the nominalist tradition. It states that references made to proper names by a subject are dependent upon the subject itself. Actually, Frege had developed this further by suggesting that the sense of a word is also defined by its reference to a mind-independent abstract object. Following in the Neoplatonist tradition, he proposed a third metaphysical realm beyond mind and nature for such subjects. The reference is defined by the subject's grasp of the object, in other words, by way of the mental act, the intentional act. Nevertheless, the principle of an internal subjective definition of terms held.
This argument was reinforced in the years after the Second World War by the turn to ordinary language, as shown in the later work of Wittgenstein and also in the work of figures such as Peter Strawson, who participated in the Oxford Ordinary Language movement. They were the heirs to logical positivism and consequently were inclined to an analytical approach to language, investigating how sentences were used in daily life ordinary language.
According to this approach, truth could no longer be taken to imply some transcendental state of affairs or even the bivalent opposite of falsity. If I say, it's raining, and then I say, it's a truth that it's raining, then the word truth adds nothing substantive to the meaning of the sentence at all. Similarly, the term reality adds nothing substantive to discussions about metaphysics and ontology. If I say, the music seemed awful, but in reality it was good, then the term reality is not referring to metaphysical matters at all. It's merely a substitution for the term however. The music seemed awful, however it was good. Given that words and sentences are used in contrasting ways by different languages and culture, ordinary language eventually adopted an ethnographic pluralist methodology, which in turn supported the view, popular until 50 years ago, that singular terms were to be regarded in general not as referential labels at all, as was the case with a more orthodox approach to correspondence, but as loose descriptions of the world. Language was vague and ambiguous and ever-changing, until enter Kripke.
The Llena Tower has a very pleasant shopping centre in the lower levels now, but I don't want to go inside. I'm going to sit outside and read Saul Kripke's Naming and Necessity, which he published in 1972. Based on lectures he'd given at Princeton 2 years earlier, even as the tower behind me was growing. He argued that proper names, such as Kripke and Llena Tower, do not ever vary their reference. He extended this to include all natural kind terms as well, such as water, squirrel and tree.
Kripke agreed that descriptive terms or propositional predicates could change their meaning from context to context, from world to world. For instance, the term the longest symphony ever performed at the Weimar Halle, or the Jena Volkshaus for that matter, could refer to a different piece in different hypothetical and counterfactual worlds, given conductors could have arbitrarily chosen different programs. However, he said that there are many singular terms, in particular proper names and natural kind terms, as I've said, which always refer to the same thing. There are two notions underlying this claim. The first was an ontological claim of externalism and the notion that the mind does not create concepts arbitrarily but involves the world. What is meant and thought is at least partly constituted by what exists in the world, even if there are epistemic restrictions on knowing things. Putnam's Twin Earth was created as an example of this refutation of internalism and to show that reality, whatever that might mean, cannot be defined exclusively by way of what is in the head. The second notion underlying the claim pertaining to singular terms reference was that of modalism. Kripke contradicted the work of logical positivists and the ordinary language movement by reintroducing a substantive role for metaphysics, and in particular modality, which pertains to the necessity or possibility or impossibility of events.
As I said in a previous episode, the logical positivists justified their positivism on very austere standards of verification, which in turn refuted the broader Aristotelian notion of modalism. That's to say, they associated the notion of necessity only with certain remote situations. If I say my brother is male, then the connection is a necessary one, because a gender is included in the definition of being a brother. But beyond human linguistic conventions, the logical positivists argued necessity doesn't exist in nature. Almost all knowledge is empirical, they said, and everything empirical is contingent.
But Kripke contradicted this in his return to Aristotelian essentialism. He rejected the logical positivist tradition of associating necessity exclusively with the a priori, such as in the example of the brother's maleness. He demonstrated how it's possible to identify necessary truths a posteriori, that's to say, empirically.
Let me try to explain how Kripke did this by looking at the example of water. The descriptive theory of meaning, outlined by Frege and Russell, said water is a descriptive term with a reference that's an object in the world that's characterised by certain attributes. It's transparent, it's tasteless, it falls as rain from the sky, and its chemistry is represented as H2O, etc.
But then Kripke applied a modal argument to this. He pointed out that most of these attributes are descriptive and contingent. They may have been different. For instance, water might have had a taste or been opaque rather than transparent if human senses had developed differently. Or, if our planet had been a desert planet, like Frank Herbert's Dune, then water might not have fallen as rain. However, there is one attribute that doesn't change: its chemical compound. In all possible worlds, water is H2O. If water has a different chemical composition in one of these other hypothetical worlds, then actually it wouldn't be water, because water is H2O. Kripke said water and H2O rigidly designate the same thing. The scientific essence of water doesn't change when subject to counterfactual modalities. Kripke went on to posit that all natural kind terms and proper names can be designated as rigid designators, the same in all possible worlds, while recognising that their descriptive attributes can change.
If I put this in musical terms, then I could say that, counterfactually, Beethoven might not have composed symphonies. I can imagine a world where his hearing difficulties developed earlier in his life and were so severe that it made it impossible for him to write even a single note. However, I cannot conceive of a world where Beethoven was not Beethoven. If he hadn't existed as Beethoven, then it wouldn't have been possible for him to not exist as Beethoven, because he wouldn't have existed.
Anything that is rigidly designated cannot be anything other than what it is. What this means is that Kripke is also outlining the necessity of identity, the principle that when objects are identical, they are necessarily identical. It was in order to explain all of this as simply as possible that Kripke further developed the semantics of possible worlds, whereby in addition to the actual world as it exists as external factuality, there's a set of alternative hypothetical worlds. He characterised all of these worlds as existing with a system of three important components. Firstly, that there is the actual world alongside the hypothetical possibility of alternative worlds, ways the world could have been. Secondly, that there's the full set of these possible worlds, incorporating every single permutation of the ways the world might have been counterfactually, or metaphorically, or otherwise. And thirdly, that there's the relations of relative possibility that exists between each of the possible worlds within the context of the full set. Kripke wasn't the first to introduce such a model. Leibniz was possibly the first. He introduced a notion whereby necessity indicates truth in all possible worlds, whereby possibility indicates truth in just some of these worlds. For instance, if in the actual world I roll a dice and get a 6, then there are 5 other hypothetical worlds, worlds that might have been, where I roll a 1 or a 2 or a 3 or 4 or 5. Perhaps there's a 7th possible world where the dice rolls off the table and into a drain, but in this case, the dice still scores 1 of 6 outcomes, and I just don't know what it is. This would be an epistemological impediment to knowing, not an additional logical alternative. So in this case, there are 6 possible worlds in the full set of possible worlds, and the relations of relative possibility describe each of these 6 worlds as entirely equivalent to one another in all facts other than the dice throw number.
So, here's how the Kripkean model, based upon the Leibniz original, would apply to another example. The fact that my name is Philip Armstrong is a contingent fact. It's not a necessary condition. In a hypothetical alternative world, my parents could have named me something different. The full set of possible worlds in this case would encompass every possible name they could have thought of for me. However, putting aside the issue of my name, the fact that I'm me exists in all of these possible worlds, which makes it a necessary truth. As in the case of the Beethoven example, it's not possible that in some other hypothetical world that I am somebody other than who I am now. If I was somebody else, then I would be them and not me.
Similarly, it's a necessary fact that my parents are my parents. If I had parents other than my actual parents, then again I wouldn't be me, and if I wasn't me, I couldn't have parents other than my actual parents. Consequently, the personal pronouns, Phil Armstrong and me, are rigid designators established as necessary a posteriori truth. Kripke then applied the principle of rigid designation to the mind-body problem and used it to refute materialistic identity theory, both the strong type-type form and the weaker token-token form.
As I've said before, Identity theory holds that mental events are identical with physical events, discovered contingently. Kripke argued that just as heat and molecular motion are both natural kind terms identified with one another as being the same thing in all possible worlds, and therefore necessarily identified with one another, so the pain and the C-fibre firing, referred to in identity theorists' example of mind-brain identity, must also be necessarily identical.
However, they're not. Pain is a rigid designator in that it always refers to the same sensation, and C-fibre firing is a rigid designator too, given it always refers to the same physiological phenomenon. But given it's possible to experience pain, perhaps in an illusory sense, without C-fibre firing, then the two things are not necessarily identical to each other. Noonan explained Kripke's point like this. The argument against token-token identity theory runs as follows. Let A name a certain particular sensation of pain, and B name a particular brain state occurring in man Jones. If A equals B is true, it is necessarily true. But it is possible for A to exist without B, and B without A. As it is not necessarily true, hence it is not true. If it was Nietzsche who refuted God, then it was Kripke who refuted modern identity theory and the notion that all thought and all art is reducible to biochemistry. If it was the German idealists who refuted the notion of a mechanistic universe in the 18th century, then it was Kripke who did the same in the 20th century. Accordingly, it seems very appropriate to grant him an honorary place in the Weimar Tradition Hall of Fame, as represented by the Iphigenia Inquiry, despite the externalist persuasion.
Indeed, I should add that Kripke's arguments do not refute the Weimar Identity Thesis, which, as I've said before, identifies mind and nature by way of analogy rather than a logically necessary attribution of identity.
I should also add there have been many material identity theorists that have in turn refuted the refutations of internalism and identity outlined by Kripke and Putnam, and I'll need to return to the notion of eliminativism when I look more closely at modern neuroscience. But back in the 1970s, identity theory was seriously undermined by these revolutionary ideas, just as the lofty goals of socialism were undermined by the totalitarian of the East German state, and just as is the case in certain other countries today. While students studying here in this tower, in what ironically had once been the liberal dukedom of Saxe-Weimar, but which had since become co-opted by the Ministry for State Security, dreamed of freedom from subjugation, so the next generation of scholars in the West started looking for different explanations of the relationship between mental states and physiological states, that about the same time as the first computers were being made available. But I think I'll leave these developments until later.
I'll finish this episode with another section from Sister Zen's Sword of Self-Abnegation. Thanks for listening.
From a wise old past,